Um, to begin, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I arrived at this as a research topic or a research agenda. When I was in graduate school studying software engineering, I read the book Algorithms of Oppression by Safia Mojanoble. Many of you probably are aware of that if you're at this conference. And having disparate sort of intellectual and scholarly interests myself, critical algorithmic studies kind of appealed to the interdisciplinary nature of this problem of computational propaganda and disinformation that we've been experiencing now in a really serious way since probably uh, 2015 or 16. I mean, that's when it really came to light around that election that it was a serious problem. So I have interest within philosophy, computer science, social psychology, sociology, cognitive science. All of these disciplines kind of need to coincide and come together to kind of tackle a problem this complex. So after reading that book and having sort of the critical algorithmic studies spark, I started to examine the literature and ended up thinking that computational propaganda was really the heart of the problem that we're experiencing thus far. And that plays directly into a manipulation of how we process information and how we know what we know, where our epistemic practice has ended up as a result of this manipulation of algorithmic mechanisms, and how can we find an antidote to what we've been experiencing and how our perceptions of reality have been sort of manipulated and divided along a number of ideological and sociocultural lines. So I wanted to start by just kind of defining computational propaganda, some mechanisms behind computational propagandists, some techniques that they use to manipulate algorithmic mechanisms and sort of provide their own alternative curation of our algorithmically curated spaces. And I'm mostly going to be focusing on social media applications, which have become sort of the standard for information seeking in a lot of realms outside of academic studies. So our students may not be looking for information to include in an academic paper or an academic project that they may be working on, but for information about a lot of other things in their lives, they're typically turning to the internet and social media applications, especially when it comes to sociocultural issues that are pertinent and at the forefront of everyone's minds. So what is computational propaganda? Finkler, Ferris, and Roberts published an entire book called Network Propaganda that's pretty valuable and has a lot of information on this topic. A lot of it focuses on the 2016 election and things that were occurring in the news media and within social media around that time period. But they define computational propaganda as the utilization of computational tools by human actors with the explicit intent to mislead or manipulate an information ecosystem in order to affect beliefs, attitudes, and preferences of a targeted population to obtain the social or political goals of a propagandist. So this isn't just limited to political campaigns. There are corporate entities that traffic in propaganda for profit, for gain, to manipulate political consensus about everything from regulations to all sorts of legislative ideas. So this is an explicit intent to kind of manipulate the conversation, control the narrative, and ensure that there is a sort of binary division along ideological lines, because it makes it easier to kind of control that narrative if there are only two choices. And that also plays into some cognitive deficits that we're going to discuss a little bit later in terms of why this propaganda actually works and why individuals are taken in by it. Howard, another researcher that's prominent in this field, I believe he's at Oxford, has found that by 2018, formal manipulative information operations were underway in 48 countries, with $500 million US being budgeted for research and development in the field of public opinion manipulation. So this is a global problem. We've seen that in the news media as well. If you followed politics outside of the US, everything from Brexit to recent elections in Italy and some other places were being manipulated behind the scenes pretty formally by all sorts of different entities in digital spaces. So there's ongoing research within these organizations as well that are trying to manipulate public opinion. They're also consistently conducting research on how to more effectively do that and how to more effectively use novel technologies such as machine learning and artificial intelligence to make it more difficult to detect when those manipulation operations are taking place. Then, of course, computational tools have hugely expanded the reach and depth of network penetration of false or misleading information by using the way that algorithms prioritize content popularity on social media sites. So at some point, as we all have figured out, our newsfeed is not representing always what we exactly want to see in our newsfeed or our timeline. The algorithm itself is making a lot of these decisions for us, and the prioritization of what might be popular and what might extract and keep our attention is sort of the priority of the algorithm itself. And it's choosing pieces of content that it thinks will keep us engaged and will keep our eyes on that application or on that social media platform or on that screen for as long as possible, and will potentially get us to interact with that application as well, and maybe continue to flow down a chain of recommended pieces of content that the algorithm is showing us. So a huge component of these computational propaganda campaigns are bots, obviously, and everybody's heard about bots by now. They're typically small software programs that are built and deployed to perform simple, repetitive tasks. So we just talked about how algorithms are prioritizing things that are popular. So we can program hundreds of thousands of bots to make something popular that isn't organically popular on its own, right? So we can program bots to comb through a given set of tweets or a set of Facebook posts or anything along those lines in a textual way, find given keywords that it's looking for, like that piece of content, share that piece of content, even comment on that piece of content at this point. So it's an artificially driven concept of popularity within the algorithm. So the score, the affinity score within the algorithm is going up as the piece of content receives more and more attention. And if you have thousands of bots that are fake accounts, sort of, putting all of their attention on this one piece of content, it can quickly rise to the top of a newsfeed algorithm or a timeline algorithm or a trending bar somewhere, and then it will sort of render some other voices or other perspectives on a given topic invisible. The work of bots isn't always negative. It can be benign and useful. News alerts, weather updates, link maintenance within Wikipedia and other such information ecosystems, sometimes link maintenance within library web pages. If you have a number of web pages that are linked together, sometimes librarians will use bots to kind of maintain those links and report broken ones. So they're not always negative. It's not always an evil thing to use a bot for something. It's just when it's deployed in this way of public opinion manipulation and algorithmic manipulation is when it becomes sort of a negative. So one individual or a small group can coordinate an army of bots. It's fairly straightforward. If you have any API access and programming knowledge to develop a bot to do something within a given platform for you. You can do it relatively quickly. And if you can make one bot to like a given piece of content that has a given keyword or keywords within it, you can sort of just replicate that code over and over again and make thousands of them if you want very easily. You can even automate that process. Typically, computational propagandists are also coordinating with human actors. So we've all probably heard about troll farms at this point as well. So there's a coordinated and complex effort between the propagandists themselves, software developers that are for hire that will build these sort of small software applications for the highest bidder without any real concern for the ethics behind building those types of entities. And then also low-wage troll farm workers who are basically doing the same tasks as a bot would, but it's they can kind of stay away from bot detection algorithms a little bit easier by actually being a human behind the screen and being able to pass the bot or not sort of tests that come up when people are trying to rid given platforms of automated and fake accounts. So as I mentioned, a lot of this comes down to algorithmic manipulation and curation of what the priorities are of a given algorithm within a given platform. They've also become significantly more sophisticated using artificial intelligence and machine learning, language learning models in order to kind of evade the typical concept of what a bot may or may not be. In the past, it was very easy to kind of point out what a bot was because they were not sophisticated enough yet. But now with language learning models, bots can kind of get to the point using machine learning algorithms that they can almost seem conversational. And this makes it much more difficult. For instance, if a bot is commenting on a given piece of content, it makes it much more difficult to determine if that's a bot or if it's a human actor, if there's a involved machine learning algorithm underneath that has a wide swath of language learning training behind it, can kind of seem almost human in its commentary. Obviously, you still, if you ever look at Twitter, you can still see the number of bots that just repeat the same phrase over and over again. That's very easy to spot. You know, some bot that's commenting on the same types of pieces of content, and they'll just comment over and over the same sentence or phrase. But the more sophisticated ones, the individuals that have more money to spend and can employ more developers to develop more complex software entities, have been able to kind of evade a lot of this detection. And it's a real problem because the efforts to kind of locate bots and remove them from a lot of social media platforms are still primitive, and it's kind of a race between the sophistication of the bot and the sophistication of the detection algorithm within a given platform. And the incentive doesn't always match up for the given social media platform to continue to spend money to make their detection algorithm more sophisticated, unless something catastrophic occurs. And in order to maintain their existence as a platform, they need to do something about it. So as I mentioned, social media algorithms prioritize and amplify content algorithmically perceived as popular. So likes, shares, comments, retweets, and other metrics are the primary metrics. And then there's also another layer in terms of social networks. So if something is popular within a given network, it's going to show up on your feed. So if you're following someone that is interacting with a piece of this computational propaganda, and it's become a trending piece of content because of these propagandist techniques, then chances are you're going to be exposed to it as well. And there's also the personalization of algorithmic systems within these social media platforms. So the more you interact, the more the platform itself learns about you, and the more the platform itself tries to come up with a way to garner more and more of your attention. So this is kind of like a values-based alignment problem when we think about information seeking and knowledge gathering and knowledge sharing, because we're not being shown the things that we're interested in from an informational disposition. We're being shown the things that the algorithm thinks is going to make us want to spend more time on their platform. So anything that is viewed as popular and is also aligned with your previous interactions with the system can kind of become an overwhelming narrative within your specific algorithm on the social media platform itself. It's almost like every individual has their own specific algorithm based on how they've interacted with the platform in the past, what you've clicked on, what you've commented on, what you've shared, what you've liked. All of that information kind of goes into which content is showed to you and which content isn't showed to you. So the values are kind of off here if we're talking about information seeking or truth seeking in any context. And as we've sort of normalized social media platforms as primary sources of information, this has allowed socially and politically powerful actors to manipulate, coerce, and control the narrative around specific issues in order to serve a given political or socio-cultural agenda. So we've seen sort of a lot of these computational propaganda campaigns be aimed at sort of a lot of socially hot button social issues. So not just elections, but elections are a big one where you see a rise in these kind of interactions with platforms, but also a lot of social protest movements are sort of either amplified or attacked from the perspectives of propagandists as well. So a lot of the disinformation occurrences that happen within the social media spaces in the United States come from outside of the country, from actors that are trying to actually continue to divide the political situation in the United States and the tribalism along ideological lines in the United States. So they will actually play both sides. So they'll bolster, for instance, if we're talking about after the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter protests that followed, in order to continue to sow unrest and discord, they will sort of amplify both sides and make the opposing narrative more and more heated as the amplification grows. So there'll be false content amplified on both sides of the argument that's causing people to become more emotional, more angry, and more divided. It's easier to divide people and keep them divided if there's only a binary choice between ideological purities. Okay. So what's the actual severity or the scope of the problem from the literature? As far back as 2014, the World Economic Forum labeled the automated spread of mis and disinformation on the internet as among the top 10 perils to civil society. So that was all the way back in 2014, before we had the 2016 election, which was sort of rife with propaganda all over the place. The vice president of integrity at Facebook, Guy Rosen, I'm not sure if he's still there or not, but he reported that between October and December of 2020 alone, Facebook had discovered and removed 1.3 billion fake user accounts from the platform. So that's Facebook's own report. 1.3 billion fake user accounts. There's probably significantly more than that that need to be removed, that maybe weren't flagged as fake accounts because the algorithm wasn't sophisticated enough to catch those accounts. Also, Facebook has had a process recently in 2020 to remove 12 million pieces of content posted or shared on the platform, specifically related just to the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine misinformation. So that's one topic, and that's a brief period of time in which 12 million pieces of false disinformation or misinformation pieces of content were on Facebook, and that was around the same time that they were trying to get rid of over 1.3 billion fake user accounts. So you can see that a lot of what's happening here can kind of muddy the waters of information seeking and muddy the waters of discourse. So we're going to get to sort of the cognitive deficits that take people into this process and make people accept some of this information rather than using traditional epistemic practices and intellectual processes to kind of discard information that they find to be just utterly false on the surface, on face value. And then when they investigate it further, sometimes they still will not discard it for a number of cognitive reasons. So outside of Facebook, on Twitter, Woolley and Guybolt in 2019 examined bots and different issues on Twitter that were being presented and where they ended up in terms of the centrality of conversations on given subject areas. The election was one of them, obviously, but they found that bots had reached sort of central positions of conversational influence around a lot of these issues. So the main drivers of the conversations in a lot of these contexts were not real accounts, but were automated accounts that had interjected themselves into the conversation, and content that they had put forward had reached sort of the central point of conversational influence in given social cultural areas. So by 2018, formal manipulative operations, again, there's probably more money being spent now. This was in 2018. Howard published this in 2020. But over $500 million of US money is being budgeted on this research and development in how to better and more effectively manipulate public opinion and to not be detected while you're manipulating public opinion. And then researchers from social psychology and sociology have pointed to the generally poor ability of users to detect whether another user that they are interacting with or that have shared a piece of content within their network is in fact a bot or an actual human being. So that was in 2014 when those researchers found that. And the technology and sophistication behind bot creation and bot behavior since then has only gotten significantly more complex and significantly more sophisticated, to the point where there are times where it's nearly impossible without tracing the origin of the account to kind of detect whether or not you're interacting with an automated account or another human being is behind the screen. So a huge issue with computational propaganda, because a lot of the efforts of propagandists are focused specifically on contentious social and cultural issues, is further marginalization of individuals that are already historically, societally marginalized in a given cultural context. So they're deliberately targeting these hot button issues to demarcate in and out groups, proliferate othering and dividing individuals into tribal adherents of binary ideological loyalty. So in studies of US midterm and presidential elections, so studying every midterm and presidential election that occurred from 2010 to 2020, scholars have found that these campaigns to target vaccine debates, these campaigns were put in place to target vaccine debates, women's reproductive rights, racial equity, immigration, and the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously. So again, racial equity, women's reproductive rights, immigration, these are all groups that are traditionally socially marginalized and have been contentious socioculturally, and have become political cudgels to divide individuals along ideological lines based on their existence. So in addition to sharing and liking negative content on these topics, bots also author comments and original posts that rely heavily on negative emotional appeals, sensationalism, harassing and defamatory language, and fear mongering. So the bots that are so sophisticated now that they're not just, they don't have, the piece of content doesn't have to be authored by a human being. Bots can be trained on language learning models to generate specific types of content depending on how the algorithm, the language learning algorithm is optimized. So bots can be created to create heavily negative messages, sensationalist messages, the same sort of fake news that we would see from, strange blogs on the internet, things along those lines can be completely generated by bots at this point and then shared into a network of other bots and then amplified within a given social media platform. And a lot of this tactic is a lot of the times referred to as astroturfing, or blanketing a social media platform with posts, comments, shares, and likes in order to render given perspective dominantly visible. So if you overwhelm an algorithm and you know what that algorithm prioritizes, you can make sure that whatever narrative you'd like to push to the top, to the surface, and to get it in front of the eyes of the most number of people possible, you can render that as the dominantly visible narrative and perspective within a given social media platform relatively easily. And this dominant position can render a false or inauthentic consensus on a given subject area. So you can push these types of content to the top of a news feed, and then if you push enough of them into the algorithm, all of the other perspectives and voices go away. So typically all you're going to be seeing is one perspective, and if you're an individual that maybe isn't epistemically prepared to deal with that kind of environment, you may just assume that this is the dominant cultural consensus, even if it has nothing to do with reality. It seems like it does, because we, as human beings, have a difficult time sometimes switching our framing between digital spaces and lived in real spaces. So as these pieces of propaganda become entrenched within homogeneous social networks, they further the marginalization of targeted groups through the perpetuation of negative stereotyping and invented essentialist narrative, which not only harms any work towards social cultural inclusivity, but also has led radicalized individuals to enact terroristic violence against falsely demonized groups. So again, there's a difference that's difficult to discern for some individuals between what they're experiencing in digital spaces on social media and what they're experiencing in their actual lives. And they can perceive something that they're afraid of that may not actually exist in real spaces. And if they're deranged enough or afraid enough, there have been obviously numbers and numbers of instances now that we can point to in which these individuals took action and enacted all sorts of forms of terroristic violence. The Tree of Life synagogue shooting comes up in my mind, where someone was sort of, immediately radicalized by fear mongering and propaganda on the internet, and then took action based on that propaganda and murdered human beings in a real space. So we've been talking a little bit about the problem of computational propaganda, how these algorithms are manipulated, how our information seeking has sort of switched locations, I would say, switched from traditional ways of seeking information to taking in a lot of information from spaces that aren't necessarily built to provide us with efficacious information, or information that we're even looking for in any context anyway. So, epistemology, the easiest way to kind of think about epistemology, the way I think about it, is how do we know what we know, and then how do we process new information and decide whether or not that new information becomes part of our personal knowledge base, or how do we evaluate the truth of that information and decide whether we want to discard it or, again, include it in that knowledge base that we have in our minds. So a lot of what we're talking about here affects both individual people at the epistemic level, and then subsequently also affects our social epistemology. So we all kind of participate in information systems. We interact with other human beings. We share information that we've come across that we think may be valuable to them, or not valuable to them, or interesting to them, or not. Sometimes we just share all of the information that we've recently come into contact with in casual conversation. So we're all participating in an epistemic system. And if we're failing epistemically at the individual level, chances are we're also failing at a systemic level as well. And the way that our information seeking processes have changed, we've started to kind of fall into some murky epistemic waters. So our social epistemic systems now are, in a sense, automated. They're very loosely defined. And a lot of that information sharing and discourse is occurring in digital social spaces, in which we can sort of take in information very quickly without proper epistemic evaluation, and share it at a significant rate with, in some cases, relative anonymity, depending on how you interact with the platform. And we can also share it at a significant depth of network penetration. You can share multiple times immediately, as many times a day as you want in some cases. And within epistemology, there's the concept of testimony. So a lot of the way that human civilization has developed has been through testimony, sharing information amongst one another, the wisdom of the crowds sort of concept. But in the case of the digital social spaces that we interact with now, because they are algorithmically curated, and because they're rife with fake accounts, and there's a lot of automation of sharing, the authority of the epistemic testimony that we're receiving has become extremely difficult to verify, almost impossible to verify in some cases, depending on the platform, and depending on what pieces of content you're interacting with and who you're deciding to accept shared information from. If you can even pick and choose, it depends on the platform. So how does the influence of social platforms that are algorithmically curated and readily accessible in seconds via any internet-connected device influence our ability to accurately examine and evaluate newly encountered information? And how and why do the tactics of computational propagandists work, right? Because as a rational actor, looking at some of the content that has been, shared hundreds of millions of times at different points in time throughout the last few years on given contested areas of social cultural discourse, it's kind of mind-boggling sometimes when you see an individual piece of content and you wonder how anyone could believe something that sounds this way or that's framed this way, or how did no one look into this further and kind of debunk the falsehood of the piece of information without it being shared further. And I think part of the problem is our epistemic disposition towards these social media platforms. I think that we tend to enter into these platforms without a critical epistemic disposition because they're used for such a wide swath of activity. So the way that things are shared on social media now, you could be looking at a piece of content that's a clip from a sporting event or a trailer for a film or a meme or anything that's sort of entertainment related. And then the next piece of content could be something related to the efficacy of a COVID-19 vaccination, right? So our disposition when we're approaching content within a lot of these platforms is without the necessary critical frame that we require when evaluating sources of information when we're specifically looking for it, right? So if we're specifically looking for information on the COVID-19 vaccine and the efficacy of that vaccine, we may go to a specific part of the internet to search for that information with a specific disposition, where we're critically reading and critically thinking about the information we're taking in. But when we're approaching it from a casual disposition in which we're just scrolling through a social media application, our epistemology may not be as critical as it was in the past. We're also interacting with these systems that are oversaturated, which makes it pretty impossible to adequately and properly epistemically evaluate new content in a lot of these cases. So we're just, everything's a content machine now, and we're just looking at our phones. And every time we look at our phones, we're bombarded with huge selections of content in every application that we open. And I think that overwhelming sense of content, can't think of the right word to describe it, but the overwhelming sense of too much content all the time kind of makes us fatigued and makes it more difficult for us to cognitively appropriately evaluate new information all the time, particularly when we're not in that critical disposition mindset. And then another aspect of this is that attention extraction that I mentioned earlier, in which the algorithm sort of learns you and your preferences and sort of isolates you algorithmically from opposing or other perspectives. So if you're starting from scratch with entering into a platform with a non-critical epistemic disposition, you may click on a bunch of things that sound interesting, that appeal to you in a certain way. We're going to talk about those cognitive deficits in a minute and why certain things appeal to us and certain things don't. But entering into that system, as soon as you make an action, you're telling the algorithm that you want more or less of this, and you're telling the algorithm, in order to optimize itself to mine your attention, it needs to show you more of this or that. So you're becoming algorithmically isolated. So if your initial epistemic practice is putting you in a situation where you are being taken in by misinformation, you're only going to continue to be taken in by more and more mis and disinformation. Because you're going to continue, the more you interact, the further the isolation becomes. and then you're within sort of your own algorithmic bubble in which only a specific voice is being heard in your timeline or your Twitter feed or whichever application you interact with. So the reason why this works, I kind of wanted to figure that out because I was wondering myself why and how, how are people taken in by some of these concepts? So I looked at the social psychology literature and the cognitive science literature and tried to figure out, what actually is the thing that is manipulating people at the individual piece of content level outside of just the algorithm. So if you're taken in by one piece of content, the algorithm can continue to show you more infinitely, right? So Scheibenzuber and colleagues examined the literature and presented a synthesis identifying the four main components of cognitive processing that contribute to epistemic failure. Reception is the first one, information acceptance, cognitive integration, and sharing. So I'm just going to go through each of these, and then we're going to talk about sort of what I came across as some antidotes to the issues that are happening with these cognitive deficits and computational propaganda and information seeking within social media applications. So reception obviously points toward the initial captivation of attention by the typical tactics of propagandists, such as sensationalism, profound negativity. This exploits the epistemic failure of negativity bias. As human beings, we are predisposed to examine something that we find as profoundly negative. So if you see a headline that's sensationalist about something insane that sounds insane that's happening, it may sort of trick your brain a bit into clicking on it and investigating it further. And also they prey on the manufacture of an illusory truth. So this is another thing, false consensus. So if we see something enough, the illusory truth effect in psychology is if you see something enough and it's repeated to you enough, you're going to start to believe it eventually. So that's part of the computational propagandist playbook, is to sort of use that illusory truth effect in order to bombard you with a given perspective, to sort of trick your brain into thinking that it's actually the truth when it isn't. Information acceptance preys upon several levels of epistemic failure inherent in human cognition related to truth evaluation, such as validation by intuition rather than evidence. Finding evidence for a lot of people takes a lot of time and a lot more cognitive effort. So a lot of people just have an intuition about something rather than a confirmation and a library of information of support when they decide something is true or false. So truth bias is also part of this. So individuals tend to want to believe information from other people that they have a relationship with as being true. And now that our relationships, we have a vastly larger number of relationships because we're now in digital spaces where you can connect with hundreds and thousands of people at once. And if we have this false perception that we know someone because they're in our network, there's a truth bias there that we want to believe that they're being truthful with us, whether they are or not, and whether we really know them or not. Confirmation bias plays into this as well. So if we validate something by intuition, we want to find other information that confirms that intuition. We don't want to feel like our intuition was incorrect, when even though in a lot of cases it can be. Human beings generally want to confirm their intuition, so they will seek out information that confirms that intuition, and then sort of remove anything that provides cognitive dissonance as crazy or doesn't make any sense. So any dissonance to that intuition is difficult for people to get by when it comes to an area where they don't necessarily have training or expertise. Cognitive integration, that stage is rooted in intuitive truth judgment and involves the desire to integrate a piece of information into one's knowledge structure by seeking out confirmation. So this is more truth bias and confirmation bias, while removing any cognitive dissonance, because we don't like to admit that we were incorrect in our intuition, right? And then the final phase is sharing, that plays into this cognitive deficit. Again, that illusory truth effect, overwhelming people with one message, can trick people into believing that something is true when it isn't. But also the truth bias is a big problem when it comes to sharing. Again, people, whether we like to admit it or not, a lot of us like to think that everyone we know is telling us the truth when they're giving us a piece of information, particularly if we have a social relationship with them outside of the digital social spaces. The problem is, in digital social spaces, people are sharing things at a rapid rate, and we're getting overwhelmed with content, and no one's necessarily evaluating the truth value of a lot of this content because of that epistemic disposition when we approach the content itself. We don't have that critical disposition all the time like we do when we're looking for specific pieces of information. So one solution that I came across related to these cognitive deficits is in the literature, the psychological literature on inoculation theory. And inoculation theory, to me and to my mind, is actually a component of critical pedagogy that's probably called another name in critical pedagogical practice, but is very similar to what we try to do in a critical pedagogical setting. So inoculation theory is kind of like how it sounds. It's sort of like an informational vaccine. So it points towards students confronting sort of a weaker form of computational propaganda, maybe identified by the instructor, created by the instructor, presented with that, and then sort of given the ability to wrestle with it and evaluate its truth value, talk through it with their classmates, and talk through maybe how you would evaluate it. Why is it a piece of propaganda? Where did it come from? Why would someone put this into the information ecosystem? So students can, work in active learning-based situations and groups and sort of be involved in critical discussion of this piece of content that's been preordained or pre-generated by the instructor, in order for them to kind of put in place in their own minds a critical epistemic disposition when they are confronted with new pieces of information in a digital social space. So we want to make sure that when we're confronting them with this piece of propaganda comes from a social media space or a space where they're not traditionally information seeking for academic purposes. So they must directly confront these artifacts of propaganda and engage with one another in order to more clearly understand and critique the mechanisms that work behind how computational propaganda spreads throughout an information system. So you can let them sort of interact with the propaganda first and work through it with each other, sort of guiding the discussion, and then sort of later on have more formalized instruction about the mechanisms behind computational propaganda to sort of help them reframe their interaction and their disposition when they're interacting with different social media platforms and content across those platforms. So you can address sort of each level of cognitive deficit that we talked about through discussion. Student awareness can be raised in terms of framing, talk about how propagandists like to confront individuals with visceral, sensationalist, and emotional narratives. Something sounds, so something makes you extremely emotional. Chances are you might want to investigate that a little further. So students can be made aware of this negativity bias and this framing concept that propagandists use in order for that information to be initially received. At the information acceptance level, you can engage students in discussion that interrogates sort of value framing and help them begin to resist the cognitive biases that are inherent in intuitive truth valuation. So you can make them aware of these cognitive biases. Why, as human beings, do we believe some of this stuff? Well, it's because we like to believe in our intuition. We like to find information that bolsters that intuition, and we like to believe others around us, whether or not they may or may not be deceiving us or providing us with junk information that they haven't investigated themselves. So it's important, again, to address that illusory truth effect as well. So you can talk about how in psychological studies, individuals that are shown the same message over and over again, no matter how absurd it is, no matter how educated and analytical those individuals are, they start to believe that thing that has been sort of hammered into their cognitive psyche, right? So you can talk about switching that disposition, that epistemic disposition from intuitive reasoning to analytical reasoning, regardless of platform, when you're coming across new information. And then at the cognitive integration level, the creation, perpetuation, and adherence of misconception needs to be addressed. So in order to correct integrated cognitive misconception, this is sort of the byproduct of correcting things at the reception and information acceptance level and sort of creating a new framework and a new disposition, epistemologically speaking, for students. So if we transform that disposition and make sure that there is a critical disposition at the front of their mind whenever they're acting with any new information, we can kind of create a categorical shift and a mental model transformation so that regardless of platform, regardless of who's sharing what with them on a given platform, how something arrived in their timeline, they can sort of automatically begin to go through the epistemic process of critiquing that information, regardless of what type of information it is. And sharing, when you start to eradicate the issues at these other levels, individuals, it's been shown in the literature, improve in terms of the quality of information that they decide to share, and they take more time in the process of sharing than they did in the past. So students can be taught to conceptualize themselves as having epistemic responsibility and being stewards of information through exposure of the severity of the problem. So this is another sort of teachable moment where you can sort of teach students, after teaching them about the cognitive deficits that they're going to have to face, you can sort of show them the severity of the problem and issues where real harm was constituted in the real world by computational propaganda. So my conclusions, our society is increasingly complex, especially within information spaces, as we've all transitioned very quickly and without too much critique initially. Now we're starting to critique it more and more, but initially we all adopted these technologies without much critique because everyone was sort of adopting them all at once. We can see the effects now, and we're critiquing them now, of disinformation, misinformation, and computational propaganda. Elections are a hot button issue. We've seen computational propagandists interfere in narratives around elections with the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine misinformation, continuous political and social cultural battles related to race, gender, sexuality, and class. We see that on a daily basis in our news cycle. And that's part of the feedback loop of propagandists as well. So sensational things get seeded into information ecosystems. They rise to the top. Someone powerful maybe shares or retweets something, and then it's on the news, and then it reaches more people, and then a feedback loop is created between the social media platform, the propagandists, and the traditional maybe not, it's not so traditional anymore, but the news media as well. So foundational understanding of computational propaganda is essential in order to engender students with the disposition to accurately assign authority and efficacy across multiple contexts while avoiding the pitfalls of cognitive deficit. Computational propaganda, it's global scale, the volume keeps increasing, the sophistication keeps increasing. And skills of critical algorithmic literacy are increasingly intractable at the individual and social level in order to inoculate the populace against this rise in computational propagandizing and preserve the epistemic viability of all of our information ecosystems. And then the antidote that I've found thus far that seems the most promising is inoculation theory and utilizing those critical pedagogical techniques to get students to experience a weaker form of computational propaganda so that they can reframe their epistemic disposition when they go and seek information on their own within these digital social spaces. But that's all I had to talk about today. I didn't get a chance, the chat would not open while I was talking. I tried to open it and read through any questions while I was talking, but it wouldn't open for some reason. So I'm gonna, maybe if I stop sharing, it'll help.
Well, I can go through them for you. Maybe the people who typed in the chat, would you like me to say some of the comments? I can just speak them to you.
Sure, that's fine. I can actually open it now. Okay.
Oh, you can. Okay, super. So we have just, I think, a couple of minutes to for any additional questions. So if anybody has any, feel free to either type them or write out your comment.
Yeah, so the comment about epistemic dispositions makes me think of the idea of situational intelligence, which I think those are sort of parallel concepts and sort of different terms for almost the same idea. So yeah, I mean the concept of the mixed use space and it being difficult to sort of switch between the two is kind of what I was trying to get at the end of the presentation, was to always be sort of in that critical epistemic disposition when interacting with mixed use spaces. So yeah, any interaction with a mixed use space where you may encounter information that is outside of the sort of trivial or entertaining aspect, you should probably switch into that critical epistemic disposition just to be aware and sort of ready cognitively to sort of associate yourself with potential false information, or engendering that in students was what I was trying to get at. I don't know if there are any others, but
yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, the session ends at 1, so I think we're out of time. But please let's all thank our speaker, and thank you, Ian. That was a great talk. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Have a good day. Hopefully my voice didn't sound too bad for everybody.
Sounded great. And thank you everybody for attending.
Thanks. Bye.